Hi, I'm Eric Pratum. Welcome to the Unfolding Thought Podcast, the show for leaders and deep thinkers who demand more than the usual fluff. If you're the kind of person who moves on from a book, video, or podcast the moment it stops making you think or introducing you to something you can use, I hope you'll feel right at home here. In each episode, we uncover the deeper, often overlooked forces that shape our thoughts and behaviors so you can see yourself, your team, and the world from a whole new angle, and then actually apply what you learn to grow and do better. On the Unfolding Thought Podcast, we aim for minimal filler and maximum insight, challenging assumptions and sparking new thinking every step of the way. Are you ready to dive deeper? Then let's get started. Have you ever dealt with a period of significant change, making major investments in training, technology, process, or maybe even sacrifices so that you could save people's jobs, only to feel like your efforts or investments fell flat? In today's episode, I speak with Kari Zeller, founder and CEO of TGN Consulting, who talks to me about how one of her first big experiences with leading real change and settling for results that are nothing less than top level came during her deployment in Operation Iraqi Freedom. We discussed transitioning from being a military officer to leading consulting for large and high-profile clients in order to help them navigate the human complexities of mergers, pivots, transformations, and significant organizational shifts. Throughout this conversation, you'll hear about Kari's focus on human-centered mobilization and why clarity of vision, engagement, and aligning people with goals matters so much more than traditional change management tactics, and why embracing human messiness is not just a soft skill that we can brush off or undervalue. And now, I bring you Kari Zeller. Kari, thank you for joining me. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a mother. I live in Colorado. I'm a backcountry skier. I love adventure, and for work, I spend a lot of my time working with leaders, executives, their teams, and their organizations in mobilizing around pretty big futures. So whether that is a strategic pivot or it's an org redesign, maybe there's been an acquisition or a merger, you might call those really big changes. And my work is really centered around the clarity of the future. And then how do we really mobilize, our teams, ourselves, and our workforces to realize that future?
If I recall correctly, I read that you were in the Air Force. Is that correct?
I was in the Air Force, yes.
And I think you have it on your website and or LinkedIn that your first experience of organizational transformation or something along those lines was in a bunker.
The first experience that I had truly of an organizational transformation was me leading one as a lieutenant during Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I was stationed in Kuwait, and where we got stationed, where we got placed was this bombed out bunker from the first Gulf War. This was nobody's home, right? We were just here for 6 months and gone, right? So there wasn't agency, there wasn't ownership. We had fairly mediocre tools, to be honest with you. Keeping the missions going, we had a pretty barely making it kind of standardization. We were supposed to hit like a 75% mission, you could call accomplishment or mission capable rate. And we were hitting about 65. We'd have pretty bad repeat, maintenance. People would take off airplanes would take off and come back. They'd have a problem and, we would fix it. They'd take off and have to come back for the same thing. That's not good. It wouldn't be good for business if we were a for-profit company. So, but things were kind of okay. And I don't know. We were just there like, we'll put up with it until we leave. It's fine. It's like 5-6 months. We can deal with this until we leave. And it wasn't until I actually got the call to go into Balad where I really got the firsthand experience and the firsthand knowledge of what we were really doing there, right? So one of our aircraft had been hit by a surface-to-air missile. I had to take a troop, it's called a maintenance recovery team, into the area, into Iraq, to fix the aircraft, to bring it back. And that's when things really got real. When I really went into Iraq and I said, oh my gosh, right? Like this is where aircraft are going. This is where the supplies are going. When those troops get on our aircraft, we're sending them, they're really needed. And all of a sudden, a 65% mission capable rate and the repeat failure was really unacceptable. It truly was unacceptable, right? Because I went into Iraq and that's when the mortar, I got to experience those mortar attacks. And so things got really meaningful. So when I came back from that, what I really saw was even, some of our aircraft that had like radar jamming equipment, things like that, when they don't fly, I kind of had the bit of a mantra for myself, which is like, man, when we don't fly, people die. They're not getting the supplies. They're not getting, new troops, fresh people. They're not getting radar jamming happening. So it was all of a sudden aircraft maintenance, which seemed like, oh, we're just going to put up with this desert place with mediocre tools and equipment and, it's fine. We'll get home soon. That was absolutely unacceptable. And it just didn't look like that when I showed up. And so when I came back from that first recovery team experience, things had to change. And so, I had to start, it really did start with me. And that's what we find when we do organizational transformation, is if the executives and the leaders aren't leading it, it's not going to happen, right? And so it must always start with those executives. My partner has a term, the fish rots from the head, which, we really only say among ourselves, but it's true. And I feel like I can say that because that happened for me. As the leader goes, so does the organization, right? And so that was in my own personal shift. I was then able to lead a shift because I now could stand for something. I could stand for what it should look like. I could say, you can't pencil whip things anymore. We actually need to do that work. We need to do the good work. And I will say we actually turned our unit completely around. But again, it didn't happen just by virtue of me. I had to learn some hard lessons around mobilization. If the senior enlisted weren't bought in, also that was not going to happen, right? If they didn't have an opportunity to contribute, to say what it should look like, to shape the future, to galvanize that next level, they knew how to communicate better with the next level down than I did, right? So I learned some really critical lessons. Who we knew ourselves as. We were the E models. We fixed the aircraft that were used in the Vietnam War, right? So we worked out of the bombed out shelters and bunkers. So we had to shift who we were for ourselves, our own identity. We had to say, and then we had to shift the way our routines and what our day-to-day work looked like. And we had to shift the way we spoke. We had to shift the things that we reinforced. And I certainly, as I was very young. I was like 26 or something like that, 25, 26. And the people, the next in line, my chiefs had daughters that were my same age. So I certainly didn't have enough credibility to just tell people what to do, right? I had to engage people and I had to engage their interest in what they cared about. And I had to make sure that they saw something, they got to be someone bigger in that change. So that's what that's when I started to really learn about mobilization.
Well, first and foremost, sounds like while you're saying, of course, that everyone's experience is different, people do different kinds of work in different locations under different stresses, that you were doing important work and work that impacted not just the work of others, but sounds very clearly like their lives. So for my own part, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
And then I think part of what I hear you saying is that some of the change that you needed to bring about had to come through winning others over or helping them buy into new behaviors and maybe new goals, if I can put it that way?
One of the principles that we really work with is the difference between being in the stands, like you can imagine, in your favorite sports, right? You're in the stands and you're looking down on the court. Like say it's basketball, or I work a lot with Canadians, so ice hockey, right? So you're in the stands, you're looking down on the ice or down on the court. That's a different view. So I think from in the stands, that's the right way to say that, right? It's what am I observing, right? How would I explain what's happening on the court? But then when you're on the court, it's a really different view, right? So I think in the stands, we say, get their buy-in to go after the goals you want. It's like, okay, you kind of comment and you explain and have opinions from the stands. On the court, it looks really different. It's like ball, I'm like here, and the ball's, what you see is the way the ball's rotating towards you. So I think from on the court, it's a little bit more like, it feels more like a co-creation. It feels more like I get to be part of that future. So the reason I don't love buy-in is because it's like as if I know where to go and I just need to convince you to go that way. From on the court is a little bit more like I have a say and I'm engaged in authoring the future here. It's guided in a way that it's not like anything goes. It's not like I'm going to give up this military thing and I'm just going to create a lemonade stand. Like, it's not like that, but it's given these parameters, how's it going to go for us? What's important to you? So from on the court, it looks like what's important to me gets included and thought about in this future you're going after. So I'm invested. I have agency. I see my part. I see the picture of what it looks like, and I'm part of that plan. I can see how I actually plan that out, right? So, and then what I really care about gets addressed in some way. Maybe not entirely, but it's considered in that, right? So I think it's a little bit different way of looking at it, if that makes sense.
It seems to me like you are not trying to get people to see your way as much as you perhaps are trying to bring out that we both want to go to the same place. And so now together, can we figure out how to work the puck or work the ball so that we end up succeeding?
In general, people have a lot less trust in their fellow humans than they could. And when you don't have trust, you try to control, coerce, manipulate, incentivize, which is not bad. Like your incentives definitely should be aligned. Incentives aren't bad. It's a fun thing. But when you rely on them, it's that old issue where if you do too much external incentivization, you take away that internal, right? But what I find is my team and I, we just have so much trust in, and we've just seen it so many times that when humans are actually heard, when they feel like, okay, you at least have what I deeply care about in mind when you're making decisions and taking actions. Maybe it doesn't go my way, but at least I can see that you understand where I'm coming from. Okay. And that you see what I see. See, if you see what I see, you truly see what I see, and you at least understand what I care about, right? It's really easy for me to start to engage in where you want to go. And it's so simple, but we skip over that step. So what we find most often is when we can clear out of the way whatever's getting in the way of people actually being able to hear and see from the different important perspectives and also speak from their own position. When you can get the garbage and the friction out of the way for that, people they have a natural inclination to mobilize towards a better future. So what gets in the way of that is either I'm pretty resigned that there could be a better future. I don't trust you enough to actually speak up in a way that I think is going to be like the cost of speaking up has to be lower than the benefit of speaking up. Okay. So, but when we're able to do our work, which is kind of clear some of that out of the way, time and time and time again, we have found that people naturally align toward a better future. The most important thing is giving each person involved in that part of that puzzle piece. And it's difficult to hear the puzzle piece, right? So, if you're at the top of the organization, those in the front lines, they do not see what you see. They just can't. They have really great ideas that make their life better, but they can't see that, we have bank covenants, we have all this stuff to deal with. Of course, it would be wonderful if we just built you a new building or gave you this new technology and we hired a bunch more labor, but then, we couldn't afford you, right? So they just don't understand the trade-offs that you see from your position. The opposite is true too. It's near impossible for an executive to see the front line's perspective, but they're making trade-offs too. And if the communication isn't aligned, we're pushing down trade-offs to a front line in a way where if we can't surface breakdowns, if we can't talk about where we're going, they have to make decisions. And sometimes the decisions and the trade-offs they're making are not the ones you want them to make. But because you refuse to see what they're actually dealing with, you can't help solve the problem, right? And that's one of the things we see over and over. It's like they're just not doing their job, right? Or all they care about is money or the benefits. No, you may have pushed them to only care about the benefits because that's all that's left for them, right? But people very much care about their identity, who they are in this organization. They care about their future, who they get to be in that future. Does it, address what they care about? And they care about their day-to-day reality. What am I doing? Who am I doing it with? Who's leading me? They care about those things a lot. And many people really care about doing a good job. You've just made it really hard for good people to do a good job. They got to work around you and survive you and make trade-offs so they can. And, one very simple example is when you don't really listen to, I don't know what to prioritize. I feel like I have too much. When you're like, no, I could do that. You don't have too much. What are you possibly doing? And just kind of dismiss that. What happens is then people make a decision on they're either going to do one thing, they have to decide what not to do, or they decide to do both, but kind of at half-ass. But they have to you're making them make that decision, right? Maybe they could do it better, but what they're saying is they don't know how. Yeah. So all that aside, what I'm saying is when you can clear the way so that, and it usually starts at the executive level, the executives can truly see what's in front of them. Actually see more accurately what's in front of them, they'll make better decisions, right? When the front lines can actually understand the context in which they're working and the different tensions and, why certain decisions are being made, they'll get in line pretty quickly. But I find that because we just don't trust people, we don't trust their intelligence, we don't trust their intentions, that we often resort too quickly to those other things. And I'm not saying that that's not sometimes required, but it's required a lot less than than what we see, if that makes sense.
I suspect that after your time in Kuwait, whatever it was that came next, which hopefully you'll tell me that there was a lot that you have learned since then until now. What were lessons that you learned along your way in your experience after Kuwait that have now informed some of the things that you're sharing, some of the positions or perspectives that you're sharing?
Oh, wow. There's been so many. I mean, that was 20 years ago. I got it, like I said, I got it together in a different way. The first 2 months I was there, we didn't actually the first 2 months we were there, we maintained the mediocre levels. But I actually got, this is a funny story, I got company grade officer of the month. So you kind of have to wonder, how did I get an award when our metrics were so bad, right? But I did what a lot of us learned to do, which is I became a master of explanations and justification. So I could tell you exactly why our engines didn't work. They would bog down and la 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 and la 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 la, right? And I was just really seen as quite smart. So somehow I got that, even though we weren't producing the results. And I think that it's, it was kind of ironic that happened. But eventually we did produce the results, right? Which is what I'm more proud of. And And based on those results, I got the opportunity to go back and teach leadership back at the Air Force Academy, to be a faculty member there. And, I had a bit of a challenge, which was, I went to the academy. I had a lot of lessons in leadership. So I got to teach leadership in the classroom, which is different than the experiential learning side of things, right? But the classroom wasn't, it's like learning leadership from a textbook. In fact, I had one of the first master's degrees in leadership. In 2002, there weren't a lot of leadership programs out there. And I had created one with University of New Mexico, and they were great enough to actually create a degree program with me and organizational leadership. So, but when I came back to teach after all of that, and here was my dilemma, is when I was in Iraq, when I was in Kuwait, I did not use any of the textbook models that I had been taught. Yet I was brought back to teach from those same textbooks, right? So I really had to take a look and say, well, what's the difference? And what did I actually pull on? And what I saw was there was a really big difference between talking about leadership, categorizing leadership. That's where, like, from in the stands, that was when the in the stands perspective, I'd say maybe an epistemological access, what we know and how we know that. And it was really different than either the experiential or some of the other, is actually like self-development training I had gotten, which was about my own being, like who I am and my experience and how I'm orienting to the world. And that was more of an ontological, like, what is it to be, access, and of a phenomenological, which is, what's my experience of it. So that was the on the court. And those are kind of my shorthands for the in the stands, in which you're talking about it, or actually creating it, which is more on the court. And I really saw that those were two different things. But most of academia is in the stands, because that's what you're doing. It's a third person perspective on something. And there's not a lot of first person research out there that's credible, that gets the authority, that makes it into the good journals. I really learned the difference because I went right from the battlefield into the classroom. And I really saw the difference between talking about something and creating and generating and transforming and developing that something in us, embodying, becoming something. So it was like talking about it or becoming. And I think that's also a key difference in most change management strategies, and why I call this mobilization, right? Is that change management talks about change. It actually came from process redesign. Here are the steps you used to take. Here's what you're now taking. It's an information-based approach. And so it has a start, and it has steps, and it has a communication, and then you do it, and then it ends, And a lot of those change management strategies fail. Well, they're very good, actually. This is a term I learned from Dave Snow. It's called bounded applicability. It's good inside the boundaries it was designed for. But it was misappropriated into the human domain of culture and things like that. And so it just people don't get mobilized by information, right? So actually, when you mobilize and when you transform and when you create it, it's a different inquiry. So going from the battlefield to the classroom, I was confronted with these really two different ways of looking at the same topic, which was leadership. And, in this other approach, you actually kind of have to look through the eyes of the human. You can't look at the human, you have to look through the eyes of the human. And through the eyes of the human, the funny thing is that humans like to end things before they begin things. See, in change management, you don't have to end anything, you just start it, right? Humans like, wait a second, what's changing? And then all of a sudden they go into like this loss and this grief. I'm like threatened now. But what are they getting threatened at? They're getting threatened that something important to them is going to go away. They're getting threatened that somehow, like, how are my relationships going to change? They're getting threatened by, what does the future hold for me? So it's so different to mobilize a human than it is to change a process. And so if I'm really going to develop and create leaders versus talk about leadership, I have to create leaders who can lock into the human experience and to engage the people they lead in a way that those people can let go of one thing and start the next thing. So that was a pretty key lesson that I learned going from one extreme to the next. And, now I would say a lot of my life is a lot of what I've learned comes through my own big transitions, even going from the military into the civilian world. So, in that kind of transition, what I learned is there's this thing called a context, and context is just so important to humans and to, what drives the way they see and the way they act and kind of their disposition, what I would call being and acting. In the military, we had a context, kind of a lens, a basic orientation towards myself, others in the world, that what we did mattered. It didn't matter. Like, we could be scrubbing toilets and we were fighting for freedom, scrubbing toilets in like Georgia. Why? Because we had the context of military service. But if you take that human and say, oh, you have skills in scrubbing toilets, let's put you in this, manufacturing plant scrubbing toilets. The context isn't there, and their life is now empty and meaningless. And who they are for themselves and their future, even though their day-to-day might use the same skill set, context is missing. And so one of the things that I did several years after I came back is I started to support service members transitioning from hardship deployments back to in garrison, back into life. And then I started supporting actually more the general officer level because they'd spent their whole life in the military, transitioning from military service to civilian life. It's very funny. Some of them were like, oh, I actually have to bring my own things to the dry cleaner, and it's just, but these are like the most brilliant, military strategists. And it's like, but how do I do civilian? And what's meaningful for me, many military members have a really hard time transitioning because what hasn't been attended to is the context. What hasn't been attended to is who they got to be in the military. Like, what's my future now? I'm just kind of like done. Like, is making money sufficient for me? No. So they're looking for something very purposeful. So context is a big thing. And when you move from one, like the current state into the future state, people are always looking for context, right? Because context really matters. What am I really doing here? And why is part of that, but there's a lot that goes into context. The future that I predict for myself tends to serve as a context for my present. So if I predict a future in which I get to be something and I get to experience things that matter for me, that becomes a context for my current actions. If I predict a future that things are not going to go well for me just because of the way it was articulated or whatever, I'm not going to be motivated to take actions towards that future. So that's a pretty big piece. The difference, again, between change management and mobilization is that change management says, here are the steps and here's where you're going. Here are the goals. Mobilization does a really good job of shifting context so that people are naturally going to take actions towards that desired future versus resist that desired future.
You're reminding me of conversations that I have quite often with friends, colleagues, clients, when I speak at conferences, whatever else. I will often talk about that once we've made a decision, once we have convinced ourselves, or, however you want to describe it, that this is the direction that we need to go, we assume that everyone else has been convinced by the same quote unquote data or
logic,
whatever else it is. Yes, that they've had just as much time as we have had to come to the same decision or to see the world in the same way. And, while we are complex, three-dimensional human beings, and we know that we flatten these people down to 2 dimensions, and we do it to all sorts of people, right? It could be your spouse. You're still going to do it in certain respects, and some people are going to do it more than others. But that I will often say something along these lines, like with good to great and the idea of having the right people and the right seats on the bus. I live in the Midwest, and when I came to the Midwest, it was odd to me to find that there are all these small towns with names like Oregon, Missouri, or Nevada, which is Nevada for anyone that's not familiar with this, Nevada, Missouri. And Kari, if you and I get on this bus, this organization, and we both say that we're going to Oregon, well, for some amount of time, we will be moving in the same direction, but eventually we'll be either slowly drifting apart in terms of destination that our project or our organization, our entity that we are a part of is the direction that we're going. We're slowly stretching any ties, anything that holds us together. And eventually we're going to realize, wait a minute, you said you were going to Oregon, but clearly you're not. Because we assumed that with the words that we said, because we often simplify that vision of the future down to a goal statement or something, even maybe it's a goal statement, but it's really vague. Like, we want to be the premier provider of X. And what does that even mean? Well, for me, it means one thing, and for you, it means another thing. And eventually we get stretched far enough apart where we start pointing at one another and saying, you don't want the same thing. You don't stand for what you said you stand for. And then those ties that, make us part of one thing snap. And people leave an organization, or they will work at counter purposes to the greater good, or counter purposes to any number of things. But it could be 5 days. It could be 5 months before that. We all thought we were going the same place.
I mean, it's such a common experience. And then even if you have, like, I've seen the right people on the bus have this experience too. We have this experience. Like, I've seen me do it and I teach it, And so I think that's something that, one of the people that have been with me the longest, her name's Lindsay. And, I like the way she said it, but I kind of cringe because it sounds so soft. But she's like, many people say that, the human messiness gets in the way of performance, but we find that the human messiness is actually the pathway to performance. I'm like, it's so true. The more and more I reflect on the way that she would say that, I said, that's true. That's really true. I didn't want to come across as too like soft, right? But when you actually look at hard performance, it's true. And so what one of the misnomers, I think, that and perhaps actually the massive disruption of AI will teach us is that humans are profoundly subjective. We have mostly related to humans as objective, as things, like not that different than objects and things, but we're profoundly subjective, and we've often pushed down the subjective aspects, meaning our interpretations of something, our moods, our emotions, and everything has been relegated to the soft side of things, right? The problem is, it is those subjective moods and interpretations that give us our behavior. So, why is it that motivational speakers work some of the time, but not all the time? Some circumstance, not all circumstance. Why is it that incentives work some of the time, but not all the time? With some people, not all people. In some circumstances, not all. How come training goes that way? How come vision goes that way? How come all of the 500 variables that have been studied in the social sciences sometimes work some of the time with some people in some circumstances, but not all the time? Why? Because when they work, it's that they have shifted the context, or they have aligned a new interpretation, or they have garnered the right motivation because they have impacted my subjective reality in such a way that my behaviors are a natural consequence of that. That's why they've worked. And leaders, we have not been taught that. And that's what mobilization is all about, is to impact the lived experience, the world, my own subjective reality in such a way that my actions are a natural consequence of it. I don't have to remember to take actions because you told me to, or you're incentivizing me that way, is because as a leader, you have taken the time to ensure that my understanding, my interpretations are lined up in that direction, but you haven't done it once. Because as subjective beings, every day we are bombarded with conversations and new narratives, right? So you tell me something once, and I think that's why I think it was John Cotter. He had one of the first change books, Leading Change or something. I don't remember what it was called, probably a couple of them. And he always said, like, over communicate by a factor of either 10 or 100. I don't remember. It was a lot. He was like, what? Over communicate by that much? Why? Because if you tell it to me once, but my friends and my colleagues and my spouse and everybody else and what I'm listening to in the news and my own being alone with my own thoughts, that's going to crowd it out, right? And so as a leader, I can't just tell people what to do. I've got to really pay attention to, it's not what I say, it's what they hear, right? It's not what I say, it's what they interpret. And it's what they interpret tomorrow and the next week and the next week. And do we actually, I got to consistently check in and listen for what is their understanding and what's getting in the way. It could be really obvious to me, but whatever's happened in their past, they've got some kind of block, right? Like I remember somebody telling me, just pick up the phone and do some cold calls. And I'm like, there's nothing I'd rather do less than that, until I had somebody shift my context in such a way that it occurred as the obvious thing to do, right? So I think, so that's one, is human beings are subjective, completely subjective. And we're leading as if they're objective. And that's a huge mismatch. So we've actually learned the wrong skills. And then we do things like emotional intelligence training to say, oh yeah, we have emotions, but we don't actually realize that it's not just an awareness, but look, if somebody's resigned, what that tells me is that their reality is there is no hope for them in the future. There is no hope for change in the future. They have given up on the future. So if I'm going to try to cram vision down their throat when they're clear there's no hope, it's going to occur like they're resisting. No, my job in that moment is to pick up on that they're resigned, not that they're resisting, and find out, what had you give up on the future? Oh, because you've tried it so many times. I understand. Well, what did you try? And let's make sure it's different this time. Right. So those are the kinds of things. And then I think the other thing that kind of pulls us apart, where you end up going to, I don't know, San Jose and I'm going to Vancouver or something, right? Instead of Oregon. What pulls us apart is when we make shifts, we don't always, we do these vague things, right? Which means, I think when things are really generalized and vague, it leaves so much room for interpretation. And so a very sharp strategy can really clarify those things. One, many people say that, I think Drucker or something got famous for culture eat strategy. And gosh, I wish I could remember the name at the moment. At any rate, sharp strategy is the cornerstone of a great culture, because they do go together, right? And so a really sharp strategy actually aligns people. And so what I find is that when you create a clear, sharp strategy, it actually has an aligning mechanism that creates the right constraints that people can be inside of. So if you just say, oh yeah, we're going west, that's not enough of a constraint. It's like, we're going west in this way, and we're specifically not going in that way, right? And so strategy makes those choices for people. And then oftentimes people don't line their structures up with the new strategy and the direction. So we might say we're now going to Oregon, but all of our meetings, the way we share information, the way we're designed, who we are able to collaborate with, our day-to-day routines has us going to Florida. And so people are having to overcome and do workarounds. We're making it very difficult for good people to do the right thing. right? So, again, we just bring it back to a level of coherence.
It seems to me that with all of the uncertainty and the change around AI, that there's probably a greater need than ever for many organizations to, I guess, mobilize the people, the resources, the strategy. I don't know exactly how many words to throw into this bucket here, because so many risk either not doing anything or working at counter purposes to their stated goals.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. This is my next project. In fact, I'm currently beginning to get myself organized to write a book on this topic. So maybe you'll have me back when that book gets published. I'm hoping that to actually be later this year. I feel like I've been training my whole life for this in many ways. One of the key methods that we've developed is what we call era work. And it's really moving an individual or an organization from one era to the next. And an era is when there's multiple changes taking place, not just one change, or something else is possible. You kind of just, you keep enacting over and over again the same pattern, right? And you need to do not just a shift in the direction, but kind of a shift in who we are for each other and what our anchor points are, and a true formation. That's a different word. We call it transformation, but a true formation is like truing up to who we are and moving into that future. And so sometimes we create eras because it gives us an opportunity to profoundly complete the past. I had said earlier, humans like to complete something. As soon as you say change, they kind of freak out about what's ending. So the era work is a method we've developed to really honor and acknowledge and complete the past, so that we are free to then invent the future and who we are in the future. And it almost is like throwing, people get really excited about New Year's. They do New Year's resolutions because they get to imagine a different future for themselves and a different them. So it's almost like throwing a new year in there. The problem is they just never completed the past part, right? And so it's giving us an excuse to be something different. And it's actually profoundly mobilizing, we find, for teams and individuals both. I started as an executive coach doing that and then shifted into the organizations. We find that a lot in M&A situations where you're bringing in multiple, we said this in the beginning of the podcast, multiple family offices who have different values, different orientations, different ways of doing things. And now somehow they have to work together as a coherent whole. It really helps when you complete the past era and you acknowledge and you celebrate and you see who you've become in that, and you honor it in such a way that you can complete. And then you start to say, well, who are we together moving forward? And what do we want to bring forward? And, what are we proud of that I've got you on my team and you on my team? So then that's where that agency and co-creation can come into play. And what we find in that method is what we're dealing with is very deep aspects of human transition, which is identity, who I am, and reality. And if you look at Bridges and Bridges, but William Bridges was really key and really a pioneer in what he called the psychological transition of humans. And I do pull on his framework. There's an ending. It begins with an ending and a letting go and a grieving. And that's the biggest part of a human psychological transition. And then you think the next part is a new beginning. Maybe you have like a tiny vision of new beginning, but like, has anybody gone through a marriage or a divorce or a career change or even of a pretty big geographic, like a location change? You get a sense of where you want to be, but it takes a long time to catch up to it. I was like on the world stage, and then I became a mom, and I was like isolated in the snow on the top of the hill in Colorado. And it wasn't like the new beginning mom. I was like, what is this? Right? And like, I didn't know, like all of a sudden my world got really small and loud and stinky and I didn't know that I liked it. I came to love it. It's like my favorite part of living right now is being a mom. Same with being married, or a divorce. Like these are things that, okay, a new beginning, it takes a while to get there, right? And so he has this thing called a neutral zone. And the neutral zone is very topsy-turvy. It's like, who am I? Where do I belong? Who are my new relationships? Do I belong? Did I just really mess up in this decision? And sometimes, I might bring in Maslow's hierarchy here. Like we have like safety concerns and belonging concerns. And, meanwhile, our leaders are telling us isn't this future great? Well, no, I'm kind of worried about, am I getting paid? Because you just gave us a whole new like HRIS system and I don't know, Workday, like whatever, right? Like, am I actually going to get paid? And how's my insurance changing? Because these are like survival needs. But we go through the neutral zone. I had my partner now, my life partner now. He's both my business partner and my life partner. And he immigrated from Canada. He said, like, for 3 years, I didn't know how to tie my shoes. Okay, so it's like the neutral zone. Things feel really topsy-turvy. And eventually you start to really move into and feel this new beginning. And now you're truly in a different space and things are really great. And wasn't it great you made that choice? And things are really okay now, and it's brighter than ever. Okay, that's the background. So I've been doing that kind of work for a long time. And that's the kind of work we do with organizations is we try to shrink the neutral zone. You can't eliminate the neutral zone. You will go through the neutral zone. But how do you hurry that up and how do you make it less damaging so that you keep your key people, you keep people as focused as possible as you're going through this. You create that awareness, and we've been pretty successful in that. Now, throw in probably the biggest transition of our time, biggest disruption of our living time, and that's AI, right? We used to be the most intelligent creatures as far as we knew. I don't care if you call it artificial, it's intelligence. And many people are projecting, AGI, artificial generalized intelligence, by the end of this year. Some people are saying we're there at the definitional problem, but it's pretty wicked at this point. When does superintelligence come about? And it's not just AI. We now have quantum computing. By 2030, we are going to have a totally different world. And I don't know that humans are really prepared for that. It's kind of like if you think back to some of the atrocities that happened in the early Americas, like there's a book called Radical Hope by Jonathan Lair, in which he speaks about the Crow Nation and Chief Plenty-Coup, who said, after the buffalo were gone, nothing happened. What did that really mean? Well, the buffalo was really like the way of life. Everything in the Crow Nation revolved around the buffalo. So when the buffalo were gone, it's not like the people died, but their meaning in life, their way of life, what mattered, died. He coined the term an ontological vulnerability. Who we are, our very being, was vulnerable. Yeah, who we are for ourselves. So again, when they moved as, they were essentially nomads and then they're on the reservation. It's like, what's the point? What's the point? So I feel like we're about to go through our buffalo moment, but we don't even know what the buffalo is. Is our buffalo our very humanity? I think we're pretty misguided on what we think the buffalo is. Some people, some optimists, and I'm part of these networks and associations, they're very optimistic about the future. Nobody's going to have to work. We're going to have universal basic income. And I thought, oh my God, that's so bad. Like, why is it bad? Because people want to contribute. They want to work. Not all jobs are created equal. Some people hate their work, but I got to have a place to contribute. I want to be mobilized as a human being. I want to be mobilized, right? And, what about our kids? And I think, so I think that's what my book is about is our new era. How do we stay human and win in the age of AI? How do we stop the fear, reimagine what it is to be human, or for organizations, reimagine value creation? How do we make sure then that we still have a seat at the table, that we lead rather than lag, that we avoid obsolescence, and I think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in all the last 20 years of supporting individuals and organizations in creating and mobilizing towards a new era and begin to look at how can we bring those lessons into what will be the biggest transition of our time, at least. And how do we do that in a way that we get to stay human, but maybe, just maybe, because we have created an other. We never had an other. But, just like you don't know light without dark, or you don't know joy without sadness, maybe, just maybe, we'll learn what it is to truly be human. And, I think some of these deep human experiences, these subjective experiences that we have tried to mitigate and push aside, may just be our competitive advantage and what makes us uniquely human. Maybe, just maybe, we'll learn that the new hybrid workforce isn't, are you at home or in the office, but it's, how do we bring, the AI, the robotics, and the human together in a way that creates a different kind of value. And I think that's our big transition. In a restaurant, I don't want to be served by a robot. I want to be served by a caring human. Do I care if a robot does the dishes? No, not really. But I think I'll be able to tell if there was a human creating a meal, like the chef creation, and the care put into things. I don't know, like when I eat my mother's lasagna, it makes me feel really good inside because there's love in there, and I don't know, like when I read a piece or I read poetry, it might be perfectly done, but there's a human element that just, it doesn't hit me the same way, so I think we need to discover what's unique about humans and what that looks like in the next era.
There was a book that was published in, I think it was the 80s, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And one of the points, if I recall correctly from the book, was similar to, was it Huxley? Or one of these people around that time saying, like Orwell presented this scenario where the way that society or whatever falls apart is that things go bad because some group of people gets power and they exert power over us. And I will list it in the show notes if I'm misattributing this, but Huxley or someone basically said the way that things are going to go wrong is that we'll have so many options that we will, I'm going to stereotype here, or overgeneralize, sorry, that's a better way to put it. We will be so entertained by TikTok or Instagram or, the fast food or whatever, that in the moment, it's great because of endorphins or something. Like that's what entertains me for maybe it's 5 minutes or maybe it's an hour before I go to bed. But the next day and in the long run, it's actually bad for us because if I spend so much time on TikTok, then I risk not sleeping enough, building human connection, or doing any number of things. And I suspect that we will have kind of a tragedy of the commons thing that occurs, that maybe it is just so much cheaper to have our food made by a robot. And yet in the long run, we lose something. What's it like? What's going to happen when I no longer have to hear and try to understand someone with a foreign accent, an accent that may be very difficult for me to understand? Because when I pick up the phone, there are already AI systems for call centers that make someone in India or wherever they are sound like they're an American. And what do I lose over time? I'm not totally sure, but having lived overseas like you have, I suspect that there is some very deep, hard to define aspect of not appreciating humanity somehow. And that we don't even notice that it's a problem until it's the equivalent of everyone littering. And then it's like, well, we're already addicted to littering. We're already addicted to social media. We're already addicted to going to the restaurant that is fast and provides X, Y, or Z. And now we can't go back. Is it Thomas Wolfe? You Can't Go Home Again, I think was the name of the title of the novel. And I say these things because it seems to me, well, one, in response to what you're saying about craving that human touch. I think there's going to be a short-termism, perhaps. But, when you talk about PE firms purchasing family businesses, for example, most entrepreneurs start a business because they have some vision of the future. Now, maybe they're not intending to change the world per se, but if I have skills as a plumber, then I probably have some dream that I am going to be able to manage my own schedule, be my own boss. I may make a bunch of money and take care of my family. I have some dreams for the future. And I'm wondering, with the work that you do, not just around the aspect of mobilizing perhaps a staff, but also it sure seems to me like there is or will be a great need to help leaders have a vision for the future, to mobilize their dreams and their desires, and to not leave them paralyzed by not knowing what's going to happen, or feeling like, I don't really know what's going to happen, but AI is going to replace us, so why would I do anything?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the resignation part, right? Yeah, I love the way, if we listen to the way you kind of went through that whole thing, that's like, I think that's our path, right? So I'd written down, you said, you can't go back. And, if you listen to kind of how you were sharing, you're already dealing with the loss. What am I losing? So we have to come to terms with that loss. And if you don't actually create an ending of an era, you prolong the transition. So organizations are full of people who never actually ended and facilitated a proper ending, and they're just hung over they're hung up with what they don't have and their orientations towards what they don't have versus what they can have, right? And so I think we need to go through that loss and really come to terms and accept. When I talk about acceptance, I don't mean tolerate. I don't mean give up. I don't mean resign ourselves to. I mean just having a more accurate relationship to what is so. What's so? AI, we can't go back. We can't actually control AI, right? This is not something we can control. This is not something we're going to go back. It's like, gosh, I wish we could go back to where we don't have iPhones. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, right? Because you can't go back in a certain way. But if we don't actually stop and see and be like, okay, this is an era, and we can actually create a bookend to that. And we can go through that grieving process, and we can, and what I find is when you do that, you actually also see the things that don't work that well, right? And you kind of see, like, if you don't do the ending, you end up having a lot of nostalgia versus really allowing yourself to create an end. And so I think there's going to be a lot of loss that we have to come to terms with. And then you started to speak even about the neutral zone, and it's going to be like this and that. And, but here's where, and it's hard to, when people throw optimism on top of, like resistance or sadness, or they try to control you with their optimism because it's so uncomfortable the way that you're thinking about, and they can't just kind of like be with where you are. It just, again, it prolongs its shift. It prolongs the transition. But I do think we need to go through that a bit. But then, what I said earlier, like, I actually have faith in human beings. The neutral zone will be like, great, everything's easy, la, 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 and then things that'll be like, oh, I'm really sad. Actually, I'm missing connection. And what's going to happen is, I said earlier, one of my phenomenal clients, and if anybody has, I think there are a lot in California and Texas. I think they're going to, they open new ones all the time, Miami and all across Canada, some other places as well. The Joey Restaurant Group or local eatery, if you go into one of their restaurants, it's not just food. And I really, really recommend you, if you have one of these, you go visit one. It's not just food, it's a place of belonging. And it's really different. Like their competitive advantage is multidimensional, but I would say it's different for me. There can be a restaurant with the exact same food, but even my 11-year-old, and I give her a couple options. I'm not going to tell you the other options. She goes, well, I want to go to Joey because I just like the people there. And my 11-year-old feels the vibe. She feels a vibe, and it feels like a place of belonging for her. And I think, the central understanding of human beings, like the most evolved beings, when I speak with them, is like they understand that they belong. They belong to the human family. They just belong, right? And so I think when we create these, like something like that, that's such a human thing, and I don't even know that it's written anywhere. I just know when I walk in that restaurant, I belong. And it feels good. And I think humans go towards things that feel good. Why do we continuously seek relationships? Because it feels good, right? And then there's an entrepreneurialism that I have faith in the entrepreneurs. I really, really do, that they're going to see an opportunity here, and they're going to be tapped into. I'm a big believer in capitalism and entrepreneurs. Why? Because they're tapping into what the market needs, what humans need. So I have faith in humans that they're going to be like, what we need is we need this. We need these kinds of opportunities. And I think the businesses will look different. I think if we try to compete with AI or pretend AI doesn't exist, we're not going to be effective. But I do think organizations now are already on their heels if they're not thinking about it, if they're not creating strategies, if they're not really honing into what will be their competitive advantage when the rest of the companies, it's not, they all have AI. We now have to take into account that you have the same technology as other people. Now you can get ahead of that, so you're further ahead in how to integrate that. But I do think if you're not coming to terms, if you're not accepting the fact that AI, robotics, definitely blockchain, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, what am I forgetting? There's just so much biotech. Like, I think that's another piece is, look at what's already happening with the use of AI and quantum in terms of health span, not just lifespan, but health span. There's been so much research in this. So if organizations aren't already thinking and entrepreneurs aren't already thinking, we're going to live longer, what's the implication of that in terms of retirement, in terms of people having enough money, in terms of people retiring in your succession, in terms of like just opportunities for new businesses? Like, I think the economy is going to shift. But if we're sitting here being afraid and resisting, we are going to miss the wave. And that's what I'm excited about now. I'm excited about working with people and organizations that want to begin to think and position themselves in a way so that they can ride that wave, and that they can be part of, they can actually be part of the authorship of the co-creation, that they can lead this shift, that they can, really steer, where we're going. Yeah. So that's my project. I'm excited about that. And that's what I'm most enjoying these days. And, everything's still the same today, right? You're still dealing with M&A and reorgs and all of that, but beginning to have an eye towards the future in which it's almost like the warning order. You're like, hey, you're about to get a new orders here. Like, get ready, get yourself ready, because things are going to shift.
There is a call to adventure in the hero's journey sort of way of thinking of things that I feel like you are presenting, which is, should everyone think that there's opportunity? Gosh, I would hope so. Not everyone will.
No.
And that's okay. But maybe even honestly, going back to some of the first things that we talked about, it sounds to me like you don't need to sell every single entrepreneur on there. You should think of this or your life or whatever as a time of opportunity. You can put out the call to adventure, and the right people will rally around that and then be willing to do the difficult work, mobilization and otherwise, to work through all of the messiness and the uncertainty that comes with every day is new. You never step in the same river twice, right? And it may be moving fast because of all of these changes that you've discussed. But what's the alternative?
Yeah.
You just resign?
Yeah. And I think, for me, we've hit on a strategy, we've hit on culture, we've hit on structure. The thing we haven't hit on a lot, maybe just a little bit, was leadership. And when you're creating a really big, and we've talked about it, but when you're creating a change, you also need to align the new leadership behaviors. And I think there's some pretty key new capacities and behaviors we're going to have to bring to bear. And, as you say, called to adventure, I think there is an adventureness. I think that, curiosity is going to just be foundational. Curiosity is going to be foundational. Authenticity is going to be really foundational, right? We're actually going to want the authentic experience where we're going to want to be able to differentiate and have that experience. And there's a whole host of, I think invention, entrepreneurialism, there's a lot of new skills and capacities as leaders that we are going to need, if we're one of the helpers moving into this new era. And we see that in everyday big changes is you do need to create and develop in yourself new capacities. And so I think, you were kind of speaking to some of those, although not necessarily calling them out. And I think that's for us to be curious about and to be on the lookout for.
Kari, you mentioned you are working on a book. If someone listens to this and they hopefully think this all sounds interesting, maybe I want to answer that call to adventure as I'm putting it. I know you speak at a fair number of events, whether that's client events or conferences or whatever else. Are there other things that you do or you might be doing, whether it's a podcast or a newsletter or, hey, just come check out my website, follow me on LinkedIn? Like where might someone go or what might they do if they wanted to answer that call?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that question. Our website is, the name of our company is TGN Consulting. And our website is just tgn-consulting.com. You can think of TGN as to generate newly, right? So TGN Consulting. I'm on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Kari Zeller, and connect with me on LinkedIn, drop me a note. I am writing this book. It'll be out later this year. If you have thoughts and want to add to the thinking, want to have a conversation, that's great. If you're an organization or an executive that, is really interested in beginning to look either strategically or what is your next era, or just begin to bring some of these conversations in as you see that there's going to be a need to change, or you can already see, I don't know what that is, but I want to begin to orient towards that. Anything that I end up publishing these days, I put on LinkedIn. I used to have a podcast, people like that. It's called The Leadership Impact. And, you can find that by searching Leadership Impact in my name. But, I'm out there. Our website tends to house a lot of what I'm doing as well. But I think LinkedIn is the best place to find me, to be honest with you.
I feel pretty consistently that I hear the same thing, that there are a lot of benefits to being active on, I don't know, Instagram or having a YouTube channel or whatever else. But generally, if you want to get a sense for the person as it relates to their thinking around work or their activity, that's not to say that, Kari, you aren't much more than what you do at work, right? But to one of your points or the statement about human messiness, right? There's a lot of you as a human that also shows up in the language of your posts, for example. And so I feel like that really is a great place to send somebody a message or follow them or whatever else, because you can over time at least talk to them potentially, but also maybe gather information about or get a feeling for who they are as it relates to what we tend to spend most of our days on, right? Which is our professions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I go in through, I'm active, I'm not, but I post when something's there for me, or, I'll post this episode, I'm sure. But I love it when people connect with me, just say, hey, I was listening to Eric's Unfolding Thought podcast, and I wanted to connect with you about this. I have something to add, or I'm curious, or have you thought about? I mean, I love that stuff. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you being here. And, I should say that Adam Wallace, who was a former guest, he connected us, and he and I have spoken off and on over the last 2-3 years, something like that. So I appreciate the connection. And I am really looking forward to your book. You and I align quite a lot in our interests. So I will certainly read it and promote it when it's out. And I hope that there are some folks who listen to this that will look you up and look for the book as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this podcast. And thanks for the opportunity to really dig into some things and, let me really, kind of unfold a topic rather than a really short answer. I really appreciate that.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. And again, thank you very much, Kari.
Hey, thank you for listening. I hope you got a lot out of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. And please share it with someone you know who'd appreciate this kind of information. If you want to bring this kind of thinking to your own business, check out mine at inboundandagile.com. We specialize in helping leaders with challenges around marketing, communications, and leadership so they can inspire real action in their people and audiences. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll come back for future episodes.